Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Be Her Village podcast. My name is Kaitlin McGreyes, and I'm the founder of Be Her Village. Be Her Village is an online gift registry for what moms really need: support, not stuff. We're talking to providers and people who care for moms in their pregnancy, their birth, their postpartum. We're talking to real moms and hearing their stories and really just getting into all the good stuff that comes along with new parenthood. So check us out, tune in, and let us know what you think.
Hello, wherever you are and however you're finding us, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm Janelle, and we are Be Her Village, a gift registry for parents to get the funds they need to pay for the pregnancy, birth, and postpartum support that they deserve. We've made it as easy to register for a doula, a massage, or breastfeeding support as it is to register for newborn clothes, a bassinet, or a stroller with four-wheel drive. If you're getting ready for a baby, create your registry of support for free at BeHerVillage.com. Today, Kaitlin McGreyes, the founder of Be Her Village, is interviewing Kate Miller of Mighty Milk, an online space for breastfeeding education classes. This episode felt very near and dear to me because I had a lot of my own struggles in the early days of breastfeeding my daughter. I like to say it was the most natural thing that I've ever done. I was lucky enough to have an amazing lactation consultant, shout out to Donna, and a really great group of new mom friends who gave me a lot of support to continue to try even when it was really hard. And I'm happy to say that my daughter and I are 2+ years into our breastfeeding journey. I would have loved to hear this episode while I was pregnant because they talk about some of the hard truths about breastfeeding and how, although it can be hard, the rough parts can be overcome with the right support and education. If you're getting ready for a baby and you want to breastfeed, this will be an awesome episode to listen to, and I'll link all of Kate's info in the show notes so you can find her classes online. And if you register with Be Her Village, you can put Mighty Milk classes directly onto your registry. As always, thank you for your support. It means so much to us. Enjoy the episode.
I'm Kate Miller, and I'm the founder of Mighty Milk, and we offer online video-based breastfeeding classes for new and expectant parents.
Awesome. Well, I am so happy to be talking to you today about all of this. I am a breastfeeding mother, or I was a breastfeeding. I feel like it's like being president. You're just that for life. Like, I am a breastfeeding mother.
Exactly. Exactly.
I breastfed for almost 6 years straight with like a 2-month break when I was pregnant with my second. But I never thought when I set out to breastfeed, I would breastfeed for 6 years. And then I had 3 kids in a row. Didn't think that was going to happen either. And so I love talking about breastfeeding and supporting people in their journey to breastfeed. And also I love supporting people in their journey and choice not to breastfeed too, because I think that there's room for all of that for sure.
Totally.
What drew you into this work? What made you start a company that helps people breastfeed?
Yeah, so when I was pregnant with my son, my firstborn, Judah, I thought that I was as ready as one could be to have a baby. So my husband and I had gone through a zillion rounds of IVF. I had all the time to prepare. I researched my perfect nursery to the bone. I had all of the onesies and adorable sweaters and adorable little hats with the ears on them. He was a February baby in New England, so
That is like the best part of having baby is the sweatshirts with the ears on them.
the ears are important.
Like, right. So obviously Be Her Village, register for support, not stuff. But also if you're
Yes.
going to register for stuff, register
Yes.
for all clothes with ears on them.
Exactly. So, and I knew I wanted to breastfeed him, and I just figured that it would be natural, which is something a lot of us assume, right? Like this is part of being a mother, is just you just know what to do when your baby arrives. And so I even had gone to a breastfeeding class at my hospital, so I was like, I am ahead of the curve, guys, like I got this. And so then my baby was born, and I was just totally blindsided by how hard it was. And I did everything I could to try to make breastfeeding work. Basically, my baby wasn't latching, and then he wasn't removing enough milk. So then my body didn't know how much milk to make, and then we had to supplement him with formula. And then he eventually just preferred bottles over nursing. And so this whole domino series of different breastfeeding challenges happened. And I was just totally flabbergasted and kind of dumbfounded by how hard everything felt. And Kaitlin, I don't know if you had this experience with your first child, or if you've seen your clients have this experience a lot, but I before having the baby, obviously I knew I needed to feed my baby, but I never thought about, or it never occurred to me how important feeding your baby is. Like, that becomes your whole world, right? It's not about your nursery. It's not about all the people who want to see the baby. Like, you have this sudden urgency when your baby's born, when you're like, oh, I don't know if I can curse, but oh,
Yeah, you can
wait,
curse.
oh shit, I have to feed this little human. And everything becomes that for a certain period of time.
Quite literally our only job as new moms is to feed
Right.
our baby. It's actually so, I love that this is where we're starting this conversation. It is so important, and it feels like, because it is, 100% of our job is to feed the baby and make sure the baby is getting enough sustenance to survive and thrive. It is overwhelming in the enormity of the magnitude of the job that we have. And like later on in parenting, yes, my kids still need to eat every 3 hours. That is still a huge thing that, we focus on. But now there's like politeness and sharing and feeling our feelings and like, exercising.
Right.
There's like all these different things where you're trying to shape them into a human. When you first have a baby, though, feeding is the one and only thing that we have to do. And it can feel so incredibly overwhelming. And I think this is one of the things for me that like shocked me as a new mom, was how lopsided that responsibility was in my relationship. Because I don't know, up until then I was like a feminist, and I thought, men and women were equal, and I was the breadwinner for a while in my relationship, and like it was all egalitarian and all this, like, and then we had a baby, and my body was the one that went through it, and my body was the one that was cut open, and my body was the one with the nipples bleeding, and my body was the one that could feed the baby every 2 or 3 hours. And it was like this incredible pressure to make this baby be okay, and it was all falling on me. It was really, really hard.
Yeah, it is hard, and I can get more into this later, into what our actual classes look like, but and certainly being the one with the breasts makes you more responsible. But one of actually our neither of our classes are titled for the mother, and there's a specific reason for that. So, for example, our expectant parents class is called Breastfeeding for Expectant Parents, because the partner role, whether it's a dad or another mom or whoever it is, the partner role is so vital for breastfeeding success. So a lot of people think breastfeeding boils down to, can I make enough milk for my baby? Yes or no. But it's your ability to reach your own breastfeeding goals is just not that simple. And there have been studies that show that one of the most important, if not the most important factor in a mother being able to reach her breastfeeding goals is whether the partner is supportive or not. So it makes such intuitive sense that, so what the studies show is that the partners who are more supportive, mothers are more easily able to reach their breastfeeding goals, and the partners who aren't supportive or are just ambivalent, those mothers have a much harder time reaching their breastfeeding goals, which makes a lot of sense, right?
Well, there's a lot there. I'm like, I want to dive into that a little bit, because that tells me, without having read those studies, that reaching our breastfeeding goals is a social emotional issue, not a physical issue. I think we focus so much on the latch, right? The latch and the, am I producing enough? Is there something physically wrong with me or my baby? But what you just described is a social emotional thing, because if your partner is super supportive, that doesn't fix your latch or your output, right? Like that fixes
Right.
the mental health surrounding the breastfeeding issue. Is that like, are we on the right track there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's a few different things, and some of these things are hard to measure. But I think that, I mean, obviously there are a very relatively very few small percentage of mothers who have some issue where they truly can't make enough milk for their baby, and in that case, if they want to breastfeed, there are ways to help them give their baby as much of their breast milk as possible. But for the vast majority of mothers are capable of producing enough milk, and so that partner role could be like you said, it could be mental health, it could be you feel that your partner is helping cook you dinner, you feel that they're helping pitch clean the dishes, pitching in all the other ways, which gives you the mental space to relax and enjoy breastfeeding a little bit more, or it gives you the space to go to a lactation consultant to visit that person. But then there's sort of another component, which I would say is the more educational component. So if you and your partner understand, and this is what our breastfeeding classes teach, if you understand the basics of how milk production work, if you understand what to expect, realistic expectations for a breastfed baby, then that can play a big role in helping your partner support you. So your partner isn't like, hey, why are you feeding the baby? You just fed the baby an hour ago. Well, guess what? That's how milk production works. So it's sort of like a marriage of just kind of having an understanding of what's normal and what's expected with a breastfed baby, with also that supportive aspect of your partner, let's say taking the baby on a carrier so that the mother can go take a shower.
Right, right. And I feel like there's so many things that come in besides the actual like physical, latching and producing, like the the ideas and myths that we have that were inserted through our childhood and through our own parents, right?
Yes.
Like you're starving the baby, right? And like, how do we know if the baby's getting anything unless we're seeing 3 to 5 ounces go in through a bottle? Why? And like you said, like that responsiveness, like, why are you feeding the baby? It hasn't been 3 hours yet. There's this cultural thing that comes along with this feeding choice. And I could see how partners having that knowledge can be so much more supportive of the breastfeeding partner.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the breastfeeding stats, so many people have the same or similar stories that I had, which is the most illustrative stat to me is that of moms who stop breastfeeding, 60% of them give up on breastfeeding before they wanted to.
Mm.
And to me, that is a tragedy, and that's such a big problem. Like, if there was anything else in life, let's say if there was a news headline tomorrow that said 60% of college students drop out before they want to, right? Red flags would be going up everywhere. People would be up in arms. Breastfeeding, that's what's happening. So the vast majority of moms in the US do start off breastfeeding at birth. It's 84%. So we know that first breastfeeding is generally happening with most parents, but the drop off really soon after that is super steep. And to your point, there are different reasons for it. One of the major reasons is people are afraid that they aren't making enough milk for their baby, and a lot of the time that's just a perception that they have, and they actually are making plenty of milk. But in our culture, we have such little exposure to breastfeeding before we do it ourselves with our own baby that people don't understand what to expect. They don't know that human babies are designed to nurse very frequently. We really live in a bottle feeding culture where, like, most of the babies, most of us, like you and I, Kaitlin, were formula fed. I mean, I don't know if you literally were formula
I
fed.
was breastfed till I was 2. My mom was like,
Yeah,
my mom was like
okay.
cloth diapering and natural
Yeah.
birthing and
Okay.
breastfeeding and like organic food well before it was trendy.
Okay, and I was actually breastfed too, but we were anomalies. Like, most babies who were born in the 80s were not breastfed. They were formula fed in the 70s. And formula has been the standard of feeding in the US for 100 plus years. And so we take a lot of those norms. For example, a formula fed baby can be fed every couple of hours on a schedule, and that works for them. But that's not how milk production works. But when we take those standards and norms and then try to cut and paste them onto breastfed babies, it doesn't work. And so, while I was struggling with breastfeeding, and I went to a parents group and realized that every other parent was having their own struggles, and then I looked at I saw all of these stats. I was just like, something isn't right. People are struggling, and there has to be a better way. Like, do we just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, breastfeeding is terrible, it's miserable for everybody, bloody nipples, totally overwhelming, such stress? Or do we say, is there something we can do? Can we do a better job of teaching parents and giving them the tools to understand how breastfeeding works, to understand when to reach for help, when to reach out for help? And so I've spent my career creating online content, and so I decided to start Mighty Milk, and I teamed up with a really amazing lactation consultant, an IBCLC, and we have created online classes. So we launched our class for expectant parents, and we're just a couple of weeks away from coming out with our newborn breastfeeding class.
Awesome. That's amazing. Yeah, there is a severe lack of knowledge of just like one of, I think, the most basic things that we can understand about breastfeeding, which is the supply and demand nature of it. Because I hear you say, so many people stop because they don't think they're making enough, which I hear that all the time. And my thought is, number one, yes, some people think they're not making enough and they're making plenty. But number two, some people are right. They're not making enough because they didn't understand the role that topping off or supplementing, quote unquote supplementing, it's like a formula industry term. You don't supplement, you're actually then replacing and starting this whole downward spiral in our production and how we're creating milk for our babies. And there's just not an understanding of the way that a breast milk supply is built and how we maintain it. And I feel like if we could teach people one thing about breastfeeding, there's so much to know, but just having an understanding of those basic mechanics would solve like 95% of this is a totally made up stat, but like I think it would solve many of the breastfeeding issues that people are running into in those early weeks and months.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's definitely I would say the number one thing, or one of the number one things that we teach in the class. And it's not just saying, this is how milk production works. You remove milk and make more milk. It doesn't end there. It's also about, and this is like part of the reason I love Be Her Village, it's because it's about understanding what postpartum life looks like, and with that understanding that, okay, this is how milk production works, and thus you're going to be spending, if you want to breastfeed your baby, you're going to be spending your first few months postpartum lying skin to skin with your baby on your chest and nursing them all the time. So it's like the science of it, but it's also setting that expectation that is realistic, because if you can go into postpartum life, especially as a first-time parent, understanding what is realistic and what is expected and what is normal, then it makes the whole process so much less stressful. And so if those parents understand, like, hey, yeah, this is your full-time job, is like lying naked with your baby for a lot of the day, and your baby's going to want to nurse. And because of the composition of human milk, and because your baby's stomach is so tiny, like, you just need to be feeding your baby all the time, and that's how it works, and it gets easier. But this is what the first few months look like. Then it really, I think, can help kind of like de-stress what we were talking about at the beginning, that total overwhelm of, oh my God, I have to feed this baby, this is so urgent.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about your experience with breastfeeding. Did you ever have that success? Like what was it like to go from somebody who was pretty dead set on breastfeeding to somebody who was an actual breastfeeding mother? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so I struggled from the moment Judah was born. I had an induction, and that's another thing, is like, I didn't even understand how my birth choices and birth options can impact breastfeeding. And it's not, and this is something that Lex, the IBCLC, talks about in our prenatal breastfeeding class. It's not like, oh, if you have this type of birth, that's bad for breastfeeding. But it's just understanding that the different paths can lead to different outcomes. And that's why, like, doing skin to skin after birth, whether you have a vaginal birth or a C-section, and just understanding how important that is, not just in the first hour after birth, but in the weeks and even the months after birth, is so crucial. But yeah, so I just struggled from the beginning. Judah wasn't latching, and then I didn't understand what newborn swallowing looked or sounded like, and so I thought he was getting milk because I saw his throat moving, but he was actually just kind of like hanging out, kind of like moving his mouth around. And so I would go to these pediatrician appointments to do weigh-ins, and each time I'd be like, what, he's not getting milk? I saw his mouth moving. And so it was just really a shocking kind of like a total shock to the system, and totally blindsiding. And I got to the point about 6 weeks in, even though I'd gone to lactation consultants so many times, that I was told that I needed to add in formula. And I was really devastated. I mean, I think there are so many other people who have been in the same position that I am. And I think it's important to say here that it's not ever, and at least for me, like, I wasn't mad that I had to feed my baby formula. I was angry that I couldn't feed my baby on my own terms, that this thing that feels so powerful and ancient and like my own birthright as a mother was taken from me. And I had recurrent miscarriages, and to me, not being able to breastfeed my baby, not being able to choose how I feed my baby, felt like another loss in a different sort of way. And so I think that the focus should be less on formula and whether formula is good or bad or whatever. Formula saves lives in some situations, and more on, of all these women, all these mothers who want to breastfeed their babies, who choose to do this, we need to be able to empower them with information so that we reverse this like literal crisis that's happening with breastfeeding in the US.
I love that so much, Kate, because there's this thing that happens where when people get together to call out large systemic cultural issues with motherhood and how we're failing mothers and parents, we end up sometimes shaming individuals. But I love the way you phrase that this is not about anti-formula or anti-anyone who chooses to formula for them. There are so many valid reasons to opt for anything other than breastfeeding. I mean, it's just, we could go, that's a whole other podcast probably, but like the idea that women and parents want to make a different choice and aren't able to because they're limited, that's the problem. That is really a huge problem in many different areas. But I mean, I see it with birth choices. Like where I live on Long Island, there just aren't, it's hospital or home. And that there's a whole lot of gray in between hospital and home. And those aren't being offered to us. And same, it's like, we want to breastfeed. There's 60, what did you say? 84% of people are starting out breastfeeding.
Correct, right.
So many of them are not able to meet those goals.
Right.
And it's not because of a glandular issue. It's not because of, something physical. It's because there's a lack of support and a lack of education. And
right,
that's
exactly.
really powerful. Can I ask you, because I mean, you have these wonderful classes that people can sign up for, and I highly encourage everyone to go out and check them out if you're seeking a breastfeeding relationship. But can we talk like a bigger scale? What does this world look like for you if you are solving this breastfeeding crisis? Paint a picture of what it looks like for mothers through the hospital, pediatricians, IBCLCs. What does this look like for a fully supported breastfeeding world?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's no silver bullet. There's no one quick fix that's going to change everything. But studies do show, and I hate to be a studies do show person, but data is important. Prenatal breastfeeding education does make a big difference in the duration that mothers breastfeed for. So, like we've talked about, if mothers and all if parents have an understanding of things like super important things like milk production, or how to read your baby's hunger cues so you know when to feed them, or how to tell if your baby's swallowing, which I could have really used. Those kind of like fundamental tips that can make they seem small, but they can make a huge difference. One of the things we teach is when to reach out for help so that people are getting help from an IBCLC early. And so the problems like I had don't snowball and make the situation like totally insurmountable. And so one big piece is education, and not all prenatal education or breastfeeding education is created equal. Like I went to a breastfeeding class and it didn't teach me breastfeeding in a way that was helpful to me. And this isn't even necessarily the fault of the classes. One thing that the IBCLC, whose name is Lex, who leads our classes, talks about is breastfeeding is meant to be learned from watching others. But most of us have never seen breastfeeding, a newborn breastfeeding up close before we do it ourselves. And so the ideal state is when we have the village where people aren't breastfeeding under covers, where we're breastfeeding out in the open, and you grow up watching newborn babies and toddlers breastfeed. But because we're just like so isolated, and because breastfeeding is this thing that happens in private behind closed doors, it's this totally new concept to us. So we have to learn it. So ideally, we wouldn't have to have Mighty Milk. Ideally, we wouldn't have to have breastfeeding classes, because that would seem so absurd, because we've not only have we watched babies for our entire lives doing it, but we have this whole network of friends and cousins and sisters who have successfully breastfed their babies for long periods of time. So you don't have to get your baby in a car in the middle of winter like I did 1,000 times to go drive to a lactation consultant. Like your lactation consultants are your village. And so we're so far removed from what more like now like rural tribal societies look like. And we just we're such a far cry from that. So the lactation education can help bridge that gap. Not saying it solves all problems, but giving people the tools and the kind of like base language to be able to get breastfeeding off to the best possible start. And then you make a great point about, I mean, hospitals and pediatricians, midwives, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And one thing that really shocked me that I learned was that pediatricians are only required to have 3 hours of lactation education. And yeah, Caitlin's nodding and shaking her head,
It's just
but
unbelievable to me.
it's unbelievable. And people don't know that, right? Like most people trust, and I did this. Absolutely. I trusted my pediatrician for advice, and he was a great guy, but he gave me bad breastfeeding advice.
Yeah.
And so even if, I think having pediatricians be properly trained and competent and giving breastfeeding advice, or at the very least making that referral to an IBCLC or somebody who has some formal breastfeeding education, is important. And in hospitals, and this is something where is such inequality based on also like where you're giving birth, what hospital you're giving birth at. Some hospitals don't have IBCLCs on staff. And that's really tragic for those moms who so want to breastfeed and need that support and can't get it. And even like I did give birth in a hospital that had IBCLCs on staff, but like not in the middle of the night, not when I needed that help, right when my baby was born. So and there's different quality support even from IBCLC. So it's just, you're like, there are so many pieces to the puzzle. And again, there's no one silver bullet, but I think that these aren't necessarily like rocket ship problems to not necessarily to solve, but to make a lot of progress on. So like climate change is a really tough issue to make strides on, but breastfeeding I think is something that we
Pretty
can tackle.
straightforward. It's like just give them the information and the rates.
Yes. And
Yeah.
we can make a big difference. So
Right.
even
I
if we
love
don't solve everything.
I have what you're talking about in terms of like the generational wisdom that we get cut off from. I have such strong feelings about that across the board, because it's once birth and babies and parenthood went behind closed doors, once they were locked behind maternity wards and sterilized in hospitals, we really lost this wisdom that each of us holds within us, that we get from the woman that comes before us and from the mother and parent that comes before us. It's really it's like, this is very strange, but it reminds me of octopuses. I don't know, octopi. I don't know what the right word for that is. But octopuses, that doesn't sound right. Octopi.
We'll have to Google it.
We'll have to Google it, and we'll have to like speak in the singular. So when an octopus is born, let's say a female octopus, she goes out and they're just inherently curious, and they learn everything that there is to know. And if you ever want a good movie to watch, My Octopus Teacher on Netflix is amazing. I didn't watch the end, so as far as I know, she's still living out there in the octopus universe, feeling great about her life. But they go out and they're curious creatures. They're highly intelligent. And then when they have babies, they protect their eggs, and the mother octopus actually protects their eggs so fiercely that they don't feed themselves, and then they die, which is horrible. But what happens with the octopus mother is that she then, all of her wisdom and knowledge that she gained through all of her curiosity dies with her, and her eggs and babies start fresh. And it feels like we're in that space right now. Like each one of us has to start from scratch. We weren't exposed to breastfeeding. I had my aunt like breastfeeding. It was all around me, but that's part of why I was successful with it, because it was totally normal at parties for people to have their shirts down and to have babies latched on, and to have that sort of breastfeeding culture in our family. But when you don't have that in your family, and when movies don't show it, and when birth and parenting is done behind closed doors, we lose out on this generational wisdom and knowledge that we share with one another. And it's so, so powerful. I love that I just asked you, like, hey, well, how do you solve this? And you were just like, well, education. It's literally that simple. Like climate change, I'm not sure, but breastfeeding, just take a class and you're going to figure it out. It's so much easier that way. I also remember I think I was like watching someone race, do a marathon or something, and I had my baby, and I went and sat down on the side of the race course and started nursing him. And this woman ran up to me and sat down next to me, and she was like, oh my God, I am always so nervous to nurse in public, but I'm going to sit down next to you and nurse. And I was like, cool, let's do it. And so because I was doing it, she felt safe enough. And that has happened to me multiple times through my nursing career, where I would just, I don't know, baby needs to be fed. It's either half a boob out or it's a crying baby. Like it's kind of your choice. And while I started out my parenting journey pretty modest, like the idea of whipping out a breast sounded horrible to me, by the end, I felt really weird about weaning and not having my boobs come out everywhere I went. So it was a funny development of that, freedom. But everywhere you go, when you are doing these things and feeding your baby as you will, where you will, it really impacts the people around you. And those small little gestures, they can build. And that's what you're saying here. It's like, if we share the knowledge, if we talk to each other, if we normalize breastfeeding and all that comes with it, that's where that shift can happen.
Yeah, totally. And first of all, I did not know that about octopus or octopi. So I'm very excited to spend my evening tonight watching some documentaries.
I would like for octopuses or octopi to land in the Mighty Milk class. I would love a segment on octopi and how we need to connect. I love it.
Yeah, and I will say something that's even harder about us humans is where these octopus babies start from scratch. We actually have to unlearn some of the damaging practices, and damaging in that, because we are a formula fed culture and we use those formula feeding norms for our babies, because our mothers and their mothers generally did give their babies formula, we have to unlearn the things that we have been taught or the ways that we were fed ourselves. So a great example, and coming back to this, but with formula, it is okay to feed your baby on a schedule a few times a day. But if your goal is to breastfeed, you want to be feeding anytime your baby's showing signs of hunger. And that could be 12 times a day. It could be 20 times a day. It could be way more than that. So
for 5 hours straight in the early evening as my baby's
exactly.
I didn't learn about cluster feeding until I was like knee deep in cluster feeding. Like, oh, what's this? And my baby,
right.
Yeah, you're not cooking dinner tonight.
Right, totally. And there have been really, and again, this is not at all anti-formula message, but there have been sketchy formula marketing practices for a long time that have basically positioned formula as superior. Not basically, they literally have positioned formula as superior to breast milk. And so a lot of the feedback I get from customers and from friends is like, oh yeah, I want to breastfeed my baby, but my mother or my mother-in-law is challenging me on this and that, or they think that I'm not taking care of the baby because of the way, they can't see how much milk is going in the baby. So for our generation, we have to go up against a lot of resistance, and sometimes from the people we love and trust the most, and that's really hard. So so part of our classes are just even like level setting on this is what we have to unlearn, break, and then relearn what is biologically normal and standard and expected for a breastfed baby.
I love it. This is such important work that you're doing, Kate, and I'm so glad that you're doing it and that you're bringing these classes to life and making a change with your work. So thank you so much for being part of Be Her Village and for coming on here and talking to me about your offerings. Can you please leave us with information about how to find you, how to find your classes?
Sure. So our website is mightymilk.co, not .com.co, and you can go on. Our classes are all on demand, so you can go watch them now, grab some popcorn. I've gotten some feedback that our customers actually binge watch the class, which is the best thing to hear, or you can watch it later. And then I also am on Instagram at mighty two underlines milk, and so post a lot of content there. And thank you so much for having me. I'm such a big fan of Be Her Village, and everybody should register there, and I'm helping to spread the good word.
Awesome. I love it. This is so great. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thanks, Kaitlin.